Good afternoon. My name is Kim Fox. I'm the former state's attorney in Cook County, Chicago, Illinois, and I'm thrilled to participate with the IIP, the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution, on today's webinar about facts, fear, and data around crime safety. We have an incredible panel with us today, and I want to do our introductions very quickly so we can get into the meat of this conversation. In recent years, conversations around crime rates have been fairly divorced from the facts. A global pandemic and other national changes have impacted crime trends, but there's been a lot of misinformation and some disinformation about what the state of crime looks like right now. It's critical that prosecutors have an understanding of what the data show, and today's discussion aims to look at recent crime data and trends, as well as explore the disconnect between some of the numbers and the broader public opinion on public safety. Helping us make sense of all of this today is Laura Bennett, who is the founder and director of the Center for Just Journalism, an organization dedicated to fostering a media environment that equips people with the information they need to build safer communities. The center connects journalism with reliable information on critical public safety and criminal legal issues and helps reporters, editors, and educators identify and implement practice changes that foster rigor, curiosity, and nuance rather than sensationalism and anecdotes in journalism. Also joining us is Ernesto Lopez. Ernesto is a senior research specialist with the Council on Criminal Justice. He joined the council after serving as a research consultant analyzing crime trends for the council's National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice. He continues to focus on crime trends and has authored over a dozen reports on crime patterns in large US cities and has a lot of information for us today. And then lastly, we're joined by Kim Smith. Kim is the director of national programs at the University of Chicago Crime Lab. In recent years, conversations about crime rates have been fairly divorced from the facts. And as we look at the disconnect between the two, Kim and the work that she's done with the Education Lab and the Crime Lab, where she works, across a portfolio of research projects and close partnerships with governmental agencies and nonprofits, as part of the Crime Lab's efforts to make access to data more accessible to the public. So I want to thank you all for joining up with us today, and we'll jump right into it. For those of you who are joining in with us and missed those introductions, the bios will be linked as well so that you can read up more about them and the organizations that they represent. So let's start with the data trends. Throughout this discussion, we will talk about the disconnect between what the facts are in regards to crime and how the public feels. But before we get to the feelings, let's start with the facts. To kick us off, we'll start with Ernesto. Ernesto, your organization recently issued a new report. Tell us what some of your findings were. Where the peaks and the valleys been with regard to violent crime, and where do things and findings stand now?
Thanks, Kim. And you're right. It's always great to start with the facts. And in our reports, we track a total of 13 offenses, which include violent and property offenses, and also drug offenses for dozens of large U.S. cities. And what we found is that 11 of those 13 offenses, when you look at the first half of 2025 compared to the first half of 2024, are below 2024 levels. So we're seeing declines in the majority of the offenses we follow. The exception is domestic violence, which is about 3% higher the first half of 2025 than the first half of 2024. And drug offenses are generally flat. What this means is crimes like homicide, aggravated assault, gun assaults, and robberies are declining through the first half of this year. And many of these crimes are continuing below levels, even below their first half of 2019 rates. Focusing on homicide, this is a major change from what we've seen in the last several years. Homicide across the US experienced a historic about 30% increase from 2019 to 2020. And we noticed that the homicide rate continued to climb in 2021, and really towards the end of the year, the second half of 2022, it started to decline. Again, when we look at that first half of 2025, we see that the average is still below the first half of 2019. However, much of that decline appears to be driven by cities with traditionally high homicide rates. So if you think of cities like maybe Baltimore, St. Louis, that have generally some of the higher homicide rates in the country, some of these sort of cities have been driving that rate down. And when we look across our sample, we still find that over half of the cities that we studied still have higher homicide rates in the first half of 2025 compared to the first half of 2019.
I just want to dig down a little bit more. When you say that those cities like Baltimore, St. Louis, and I would even suggest probably Chicago is
Sure.
in somewhere, are driving that. What to explain why they carry such a heavy factor in driving down the national crime rates as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think part of it it's sort of a mathematical function that if you have a lower homicide city, maybe like a Cary, North Carolina in our sample or a Chandler, Arizona, you can't go below zero, right? It's just you're limited of how far on one side you can go. But if you have some of these higher homicide cities, they have sort of room on both sides, right? They can increase a lot or they can decrease a lot. So I think some of that is there. I think it's just sort of a statistical issue. But at the same time, there's been a lot of investments in these large cities. Can't really claim anything causal yet, and I think we'll get to some of that later. But it's just something that we're seeing is that these higher homicide cities traditionally high homicide cities, so before those 2020 rates, have declined significantly, while these lower homicide city rates are sort of lingering in those middle to higher levels for them. So that's an interesting pattern that we're seeing in the data. Again, I think some of that is statistical, but there could be something more there that we need to explore further.
Thank you for that, and we'll circle back to some of that nuance that you described. Kim Smith, let's turn to some specifics and contextualize the national picture Ernesto just painted. What story does the data tell us in a city like Chicago, as Ernesto would describe as one of the higher homicide rates before we started to see this trend? What are some of the trends that you've noticed when it comes to crime in Chicago specifically in recent years?
Thank you, Kim, and thanks for having me in this conversation. I wanted to take even a bit of a further step back in Chicago because I think Chicago is a very interesting case study when it comes to national or when it comes to recent crime trends, specifically as it relates to gun violence. So, going back to 2016, that was actually the year that Chicago experienced its first year-over-year increase in homicides. Between 2015 and 2016, shootings and homicides increased 60%. And at the time, that was unprecedented for a city the size of Chicago. Unfortunately, in the last few years, during the pandemic, other cities experienced a similar surge. But in 2016, Chicago was really unique amongst its peers in that type of a surge in gun violence. And I think it's important because the city then had 3 consecutive years of reductions in 2017, 2018, 2019. Things were starting to revert to kind of pre-2016 levels. And then, of course, again, during 2020 and 2021, Chicago had its second once in a generation increase in gun violence. So coming off of those two big spikes, really pleased to report that we've seen continued declines since 2021. And this year, the city is on track to end the year with its lowest homicide count in a decade. This year, compared to last year, homicides are down 29% in the city of Chicago. And we've seen a close to 40% reduction in shootings. So again, if those trends hold, that will result in between 300 and 450 homicides. And again, on the higher end, that would be the lowest count in over a decade. Of course, despite some of these encouraging trends, Chicago is a city that continues to grapple with inequities in many respects, including with respect to safety. We know, for example, that the burden of gun violence is not borne equally by all of our city's residents and all of our city's neighborhoods. And one thing I wanted to share is just how unequal that burden is. So one of the things we've done in Chicago is look at the homicide rate broken out by kind of cluster of neighborhood. So here, what we're looking at is the homicide rate in the areas with the neighborhoods with the 20 neighborhoods with the highest homicide rate, the middle 37 neighborhoods, and the areas with the kind of lowest homicide rates. And you can see that in 2024, this is data from last year, the neighborhoods with the highest homicide rates had 68 times more homicides than those with the lowest rates. And I think this is really important when we, get to the point in the conversation that we're talking about solutions, because the burden is not borne equally by all of the residents of the city. It's really important to make sure that when we talk about resources and investments, those investments are being driven to the areas that are facing a disproportionate burden of gun violence. And oftentimes, those are the very neighborhoods that are left out of these conversations about safety and justice. Another way to look at some of this data is to look at the burden by race in the US and in Chicago. What we see is the disproportionate number of homicide victims in the country are Black males. That's the same population that is overrepresented when we look at incarceration rates. And I think that's just important because that dual burden has implications for how we think about solutions. The final thing that I'll share is just how important it is to talk about gun violence when we talk about this country's homicide and kind of public safety challenge. We can see that we are an outlier compared to high income countries when it comes to our homicide rate. And that is almost entirely driven by the gun homicide rate in this country. The non-gun homicide rate in the United States, in the UK, Australia, Germany looks really similar. Where we have an issue of American exceptionalism is with our gun homicide rate. And again, I think that's really important as we think about solutions. What are we focusing on when we talk about crime and gun violence? And where are we kind of focusing our efforts? So I just wanted to share some of that international context as well.
Thank you for that context, Kim. And I will acknowledge, as you were going back over the data started in 2016 in Chicago, my heart started to quicken a little bit. For context for our viewers, I came into office as the Cook County State's Attorney here in Chicago back in December of 2016. And so we'd had 11 months of that spike that was incredibly jarring given the crime trends that we had seen over time, and had the concern of the community of what we're going to do. And so as we talk about data and transparency, one of the things that I did when I first came into office was make available all of the data that we had around prosecutions and the work that we were doing to allay some of the fears and concerns that the public was having about what's happening with crime. And so we can talk about that, but we started that in 2017, and it mirrored exactly what you said. We were seeing levels of violent crime in Chicago decrease from that really high level that was anomalous to what we'd seen in years past, year over year for 3 years straight. And it is in fact true that in 2020, we started in the beginning of 2020 before the pandemic to see an uptick, and then really this second wave take hold. And so as prosecutors, it's really important that we understand and appreciate what those trends look like. And we can talk about that in a bit, but also owning the data around or having data available to be able to identify, is this something that is an anomaly or is this something that is a trend? And so we'll get into that a bit later, but you did quicken my heart a bit. So I need to jump in on that. And Laura, I want to turn to you. So I'm hearing a story around data that is suggesting that the picture around crime and violence is turning from this period of time in the last couple years, which was angst-inducing for many folks. Whether you lived in a large city or a small town, there were concerns about rising violent crime, and the data suggests that we are on a different trajectory, that those numbers are going down. But I don't get the sense that the public is aware of that. And so I'm curious, Laura, if you can share with us, did you notice any shifts in journalistic practices during the pandemic and around the reporting and coverage around safety? And if you did, why?
Thanks so much, Kim. So, like you set up for us at the beginning, I think this is a conversation that's half about facts and half about feelings. And I'm going to bring right now in some facts about feelings that I think will help us understand a little bit better what's going on here. So, you're exactly right that public perception of crime is not really matched up right now with reality. So, Gallup has been asking people about their perceptions of crime since the 1980s. They've asked this question almost every year since 1989. And what you'll see in this graph that I'm showing right now is that in almost every year since they've asked that question, a majority of Americans have said that they think that crime is increasing. So there are a couple of years here in the very early 2000s where less than 50% of Americans said that they thought crime was increasing. But in every other year since they've asked, a majority, and sometimes really large majorities, have said that they thought crime was going up. In 2024, when we know, as Ernesto said, that crime was dropping in almost every major category, 64% of Americans thought that crime was increasing. So there's clearly a major disconnect. And I think there's, having thought about this a lot, I sort of think about there being three major reasons for this, and I'll spend the most time talking about the media part of it. One thing is, I think just kind of we can just chalk it up to human psychology, and so I'm not sure there's a lot anybody can really do. Humans are not great at perceiving risk. We tend to be more afraid of things that have sort of catastrophic potential, that involve another human being relative to like a natural force, for example, and things that are outside of our control. So crime meets all three of those things. So we're just a lot more afraid of crime than we are of, say, like falling and hurting ourselves at work, even though those two things might be sort of equally harmful to us, to our physical safety. So there's part of our sort of like evolutionary brain that just isn't working in our favor here. A second factor is that just when Gallup asks this question, they use the word crime. That's not a word with a really clear and precise immutable definition. It has all sorts of sort of political and historical baggage attached to it. So when we're talking about crime trends, we're talking about 7 or 13 crimes that are tracked by the police. That's certainly not every type of crime. It's far from every type of illegal. It's far from every type of illegal activity. It's also not every single thing that can impact our safety in one way or another. And we know that crime is a really politically loaded topic. And you can see here, this is Gallup as well, showing that people's perceptions of crime really track closely with their political affiliation. So when a Republican is president, Democrats tend to think crime is high, tend to believe crime is increasing. When a Democrat is president, Republicans tend to think crime is increasing. And we've seen that sort of dichotomy since 2001. So during the Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations, we see this really stark disconnect. So there's something about the word crime that is triggering like political baggage that isn't necessarily really related to data or statistics about these particular offenses at all. So that's two things I think is going on. And then the third, Kim, as you mentioned, is about media coverage. And we know that, so Gallup, another thing Gallup asks, or actually I think it's Pew. Pew asks people, when you're thinking about whether crime is going up or down, what are you basing that information on? And the majority of people still say the news. They don't say social media. They don't say their personal experiences. They say the news. So we know the news has a big impact, and we know the news does not always cover crime in a measured, responsible, evidence-based way. There are certainly still lots of media practices that sort of rely on anecdotes, lurid details, episodic crime coverage with sensational language. So in 2020, we saw lots of crime surge, crime wave, crime spike, these words that are really evocative. We see images in the stories of smashed glass and handcuffs and lights and barbed wire and things that are really alarming. And we know from research, not just from, my own personal opinion, that coverage has a real impact. The standard script of local TV news, researchers have shown that it elicits fear, which drives punitiveness. So there's a real trend going on in the news media, and as crime started to sort of fall off, a lot of those practices have stayed in place. So if you just watch the local nightly news, you wouldn't necessarily know that there's a big crime decline, and I think that's part of what's going on in terms of this real gap between perception and reality.
Well, can I dig a little bit there? Because I see that, right? Just recently in Chicago, which is seeing declining crime rates, the mayor has been talking about it because, as you said, crime and the perception of crime is very political, right? I go back to thinking of Willie Horton
Yep.
way back in 1988, torpedoing Michael Dukakis's
Yep.
chances of being president, and a playbook politically that was established around crime, fear and crime, and like what works and what permeates. And so it is not a surprise to see, the study that you list about people feeling based on their political space and who's in leadership, that disconnect. My question is, so, like as I said a couple weeks ago, our mayor was touting the data, which I think, again, is incredibly important to level set, which is why we started here. And then there's a horrible, awful mass shooting at a nightclub 2 days after he has done some press around this. And one of the leading editorial boards for the major newspaper says, don't talk about crime going down because look, a horrible thing has happened. What is what drives that in journalism? And so it's less about like what the impact is. We've heard the phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. What is the incentive structure to create that universe that you just described? What is the incentive structure that, yes, crime rates are down, but I also know that people are really afraid. And so I'm not really talking about crime rates being down. Why is that a journalistic uh hurdle that we continue to face? What drives that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. One is like sort of journalism 101 is that you need a human story to go with, you need a human element to go with every story. And I think a lot of journalists find it to be challenging to attach a sort of human story to a piece about crime decline. It's really hard to identify a person who did not die because of gun violence. That is just really hard. Now, of course, there are creative things people can be doing, get out in the community, go to the hardest hit neighborhoods, talk about how it's different to be living there now than it was in the spring of 2021. I don't want to let anybody off the hook here. You can do this work and you can do it well. But I think there is a real desire to have a face to put on a story, and that is just a lot easier with a crime than with the lack of a crime. Counterfactuals are hard to cover. So that's one thing. Another thing is just sort of in the jockeying for attention that goes on in the sort of like increasingly competitive and difficult media markets, owners say that these stories about with like lurid headlines do well. People click on it for those psychological reasons that I was talking about before. The stuff performs well because it plays on that really fearful part of our brain that's like always looking for a threat. But in my opinion, that's also not an excuse. Journalism, the whole point should not just be to maximize the number of clicks possible. I think there's a way to like have lots of great reporting on like sports and other things people love to click on. But when you're going to report on something that has really, life or death impacts and impacts on people's freedom, you have to be responsible and not just go with the most lurid and sensationalistic things. So you've got to zoom out, you've got to focus on trends over anecdotes, and you've got to avoid this type of coverage that's just playing out one anecdote after another without any relevant context. We have not yet found a society that's been able to entirely eradicate violence. And so if Mayor Johnson is not allowed to ever talk about a crime decline because something horrible happened, that just doesn't make sense. Until we are able to really find the thing that stops all crime and all violence completely, people have got to be able to zoom out and talk about trends because it's the responsible way to do it and the only way we're going to figure out what works and what doesn't to reduce crime and stop having, so many victims.
Thank you for that. And I just another fine point on it, because it's a subject that I'm really sensitive to. When I listen to Kim show the data about the neighborhoods that are most impacted by crime, that even as you talk about the humanity, the humanness of a story of someone being injured, it is also not lost on me that depending on who the victim of violent crime is and the coverage of that story is amplified. And so if violence is concentrated in certain areas of the city, and it is just enough to say two people dead here, versus if a more affluent part of the city where crime traditionally doesn't happen. And we'll talk a little bit about that as in the wake of COVID. That is amplified. The story of the kid who comes from the suburbs, who is on his way to a concert and is horribly struck down in violence, is treated very differently than the kid who's walking home from wherever he was, work or hanging out on the South Side, who's killed. Like those disparities, even in the actual victimization, particularly around locations where we expect high levels of crime, is something that I've noted, and I really appreciated Kim's uh, slide on that, because I think it actually does go hand in hand in how the coverage, at least locally, has been depending on who the victims of crime are.
Yeah, I think I sort of skipped too quickly when I said standard script of crime news. That's what I mean. I mean, the stories that tend to get grabbed and played over and over again have a black male perpetrator, a white victim, particularly a female victim or an older victim or a child victim. And these are the things that play on repeat. But like you said, Kim, if it's, two young black men who were shot, the story will be 3, 4 paragraphs, 3, 4 sentences long, you know, two men shot in X neighborhood, and then, the news cycle moves on. So it's incredibly harmful and biased what's going on there.
Thank you. So I want to take us back and raise everyone's angst again for the 2020 when the pandemic hit. As was noted in the information provided earlier, is that we did start to see this a rise in violent crime categories even before the lockdowns began in March of 2020. And so, Ernesto, I do want to talk to you because it's hard to talk about, as Kim put it, the waves that we've seen, this most recent wave, without talking about the pandemic. How did the global pandemic, a once in 100 years event, impact crime trends, and how did, coming out of that, what did that look like? But let's start with this once in 100 years global event. What happened?
Yeah, that once in 100 years is a challenge because the research going back 100 years ago wasn't really that thorough. So didn't really know what to expect with that. But it's important to understand when you're analyzing crime trends throughout the US that crime is complicated. There's a lot of social factors that influence crime. We don't really want to think of it as one thing causes crime across a nation that shifts trends. We've talked about there's a lot of variation within cities, variation within neighborhoods. And so, that's important context, I think, to have here when we're talking about 2020. With that said, I don't believe that the pandemic had an immediate and direct effect on some crimes such as homicide and aggravated assault, but did have immediate reductions in crimes like shoplifting and robbery, where you're seeing less activity on the street. People are out less, right? If you're getting robbed, you're going to be robbed most likely outside your home, because inside your home is generally going to be a burglary. So there's different patterns there. And I base that statement not only on the work we've done at the council, but on the scholarly literature that finds that there was some uptick in late 2019 when it comes to crimes like homicide and other, again, scholarly research that when you look at the early part of 20 or the early part of the pandemic, so those first weeks, maybe month or two, and you compare it to the time to those first about 2.5 months of 2020, there's not much of a difference in homicide rates. you really start to see that spike, significant spike in the summer of 2020 that's higher than you would normally expect. Now, that's not to say that as we've moved through the pandemic, that strain didn't play a role or that the other effects of the pandemic didn't play a role. But it gets really complicated to measure that quickly. There is some limited qualitative, so research from mostly interviews that may suggest that the pandemic could have been a tipping point for some people. So at the individual level, sort of just as their lives changed in response to the pandemic, that pushed them towards serious criminal behavior. Again, that's very limited, small sample size, which is common in qualitative research. Um, so I think that's one thing to keep in mind. And what really complicates it again is it wasn't too far after the start of the pandemic, about 2 months, you have the murder of George Floyd and you have subsequent protests. You can look at data from a variety of cities, and the weekend after George Floyd's murder, you see a large increase in non-residential burglaries, which are in essence just looting. And it's a very quick one week spike in many cases. Um, so that paints that story. It's a complicated story to tell. And with that said, I would have assumed that as we moved away from 2020, whatever those causes were been, we would come closer to 2019 levels. But the fact that we're seeing in many cities rates fall below, specifically homicide rates, fall below those 2019 levels, um, it's more than just a simple returning back to normal, regression to the mean. As was mentioned earlier, Chicago could be at a, 10-year low in homicide. And so that's positive, and we need to do a lot more work to understand what's driving these trends and not ignore what may have been going on before 2020. And was, as mentioned earlier, that some cities like Chicago and even Baltimore were seeing high levels of homicide in 2015, 2016. So it's complicated, but I think we need to do a lot more research to understand what's contributing to the decline.
You're right, it's complicated. And I think for many of us who do this work, we look for the simple answer. And so even as I say, it was a once in 100-year thing. It's not to say that it's causal, but it is, we have to put it in the context. And I think you're absolutely right. Having lived through 2020 and we saw those spikes and we saw what was happening. And at the time, folks were just grasping for answers, which is why I really appreciate the IIP for a panel like this, that it was, oh, it's this policy, right? That it's one simple policy that now we're all of a sudden seeing crime spikes. And it's like, oh, I don't know that we've had enough time, distance, and an analysis of everything that was happening. But the reaction, the immediate reaction at the time, and I won't even say from media, I will say from elected officials, who have people who are afraid, who are now watching this and they want a response. And the immediate thing is to try to have an answer that sometimes may take years
Yep.
to formulate. So I do appreciate the nuance that
I'll just briefly add to that. A lot of the reaction you're talking about locally was from city officials that knew their data, but they didn't know other city data or other national data. And that's why the council started these reports, because federal crime data is so delayed. So if there is not even a once in 100-year pandemic, but other crime events that could shift crime quickly, we don't really know. So we need to have a better data infrastructure as well.
You're absolutely right. And I appreciate the work that the council's been doing in that realm. And as an advisory board member, I should be in full disclosure that I deeply appreciate that work because that national context does matter. But I will also say, again, the struggle for our prosecutors who are on this call is that there is the data, there is the facts, and then there's the feelings, and then there's the sense of responsibility to answer for something in real time. And so I remember saying, listen, I think we're watching a crime increase across other major cities as well, and being responded with, we don't care about what's happening in other cities. I care about what's happening here. And conversely, as I watch the data say that crime, violent crime trends are going downward, in places like Baltimore or Atlanta and the like, it's like, oh, so you can't claim Chicago is somehow special because everybody's going down. It's a very interesting dynamic that we're seeing play out. And Kim Smith, you were here in Chicago during the pandemic and have been studying before and after. What is that, perspective that you have from that period of time to offer?
I mean, I think your point about the kind of macro factors, both hindering the like city level progress argument, but also, not being considered when we talk about like national trends it's a really good one. And I think, what we did in 2020, 2021, when we saw these increases in Chicago was look at the national data to understand, are we an outlier as we were in 2016, or might there be other factors that are not necessarily specific to Chicago contributing to some of these trends? And of course, we looked at the employment data. We looked at, the population of young people who we know are most likely to be involved in gun violence nationally. We're facing, high unemployment rates. We looked at the CDC data. 75% of young people, again, the kind of population that we know is most likely to be involved in gun violence. 75% were struggling with mental health or substance use challenges. We know that a lot of the kind of social infrastructure, so violence prevention programs, whether it be hospital-based work, in-person therapy, mentoring, a lot of that was halted in Chicago and elsewhere or forced online. So the kind of absence of those supports, the absence of what we call eyes on the street, whether it be a police officer or a school teacher or your neighbor down the block. We think that in general is something that kind of sets apart neighborhoods with high and low rates of crime, cities with high and low rates of crime, that eyes on the street. We know that was impacted during the pandemic. So we looked at a lot of those national factors. We looked at some of what was happening specifically in Chicago. For example, we saw, again, because the data was available, it's not available in all places, but we saw what we think was an increase in illegal gun carrying. There's no official way to know who's carrying a gun. It's not measured. But we saw, I think, 100% increase in the likelihood that an arrest or a stop would result in a firearm being recovered. We also saw at the state level a 44% increase in the number of FOID, firearm owner identification requests. So we saw an increase in the kind of desire to purchase a firearm in the state of Illinois. We saw that in other cities. In the past, we've surveyed individuals who have been incarcerated for firearm offenses, and many individuals, not shockingly, carry firearms because they're worried about their safety. They don't believe that the kind of structures and systems in place will keep them safe, so they carry a firearm because they believe that is what will result in their safety. So we saw some of these things happening in Chicago. We think some of that was mirrored in other cities, but the kind of combination of unemployment, the disruption of social services, the lack of eyes on the street, and then the kind of fear that results in a vicious cycle of gun violence, we think all kind of came together and is what in part led to the gun violence surge in Chicago. I think that's also really important because as we look to the present moment where we've seen reductions, I think the kind of restoration of some of those things. So we have more social services available happening in person. We have more eyes on the street as central business districts. People are back out and about. I think it's really important to look at what we think those causes might have been in 2020 and 2021 as we think about what we should continue to do in 2024, 2025, 2026, and beyond. But it is a really hard research question, as Ernesto kind of alluded to. There was not a controlled, research design, and we could say because the city of Chicago implemented this policy, their homicide rate did not increase as much as it could have. I think this latest kind of spike in homicides is something that researchers will be continuing to argue about, debate about, collect information on for years to come. And I think that is important to note because we do actually have an opportunity now, as crime is going down in different cities, to think critically about the investments that we're making and whether we can learn about the ROI we're getting on those investments, not just from safety, but from other things that we care about, such as education and employment. So I would just always make a plug for research. And I actually think prosecutors' offices have a really big role to play as innovative strategies are being rolled out. Even as a data partner, I think prosecutors' offices can really lead the way in improving our understanding of what works to reduce gun violence in this country.
Thank you for that, Kim. I want to pause for a moment on just remembering that time period too. Like, so you talk about, an increase in illegal possession, the 40% increase in people going in Illinois to get firearms identification cards. And again, to the anecdotal, I was the state's attorney at the time. I live in a neighborhood that would not be on your graph for a high incidence of violence. And I remember getting a text message from the women's group in my neighborhood who were inviting the women in our neighborhood to come and go take lessons to get our concealed carry license. And that was based on a real fear that the women in our neighborhood, again, not a neighborhood that is a high crime neighborhood, not a community that's seen high incidence of gun violence, but the fear that was permeating in the country at that time, not just around the illness, but around violence, such that the women here felt the need to protect themselves. And I've never lost what that felt like. And I chose not to do it just because I just my discomfort with holding a gun, but that it made sense to people that someone who lived in a neighborhood like mine and all the things that were happening, that these women who maybe never picked up a gun would be afraid given the narrative that was happening. And I never divorced that from that statistic that you give of people who live in neighborhoods that have high incidence of violence, who too may have felt that fear and then felt the need to protect themselves. But the response from the law is very different. I, who have no background and have the presumption is that I want to be safe. The presumption of someone living in a high crime neighborhood who has not gone through the steps to get their firearms identification card or concealed carry license is a presumption of nefariousness. And lost in there was this period of time that was really, for as a nation, gripped with fear for all things. I think enough folks had watched, Netflix movies about the apocalypse and things happening that, that was the reaction. Um, and it's really important for our prosecutors on the phone or on this call to hear what Kim is saying, having that data available about what's coming in, what you are doing, and sharing to look at context, not just in that moment, but before and hopefully after, so that we're not responding in ways, which is typically what's done, is this moment in time that gives us a response that is a policy or a law that changes, that is punitive for this moment, that may have consequences that were unforeseen later on. As I go back to what felt like this apocalyptic moment, Laura, I want to bring you back in. And we alluded to it a little bit in my original question, but you take us back to the COVID, and not just as it related to violence, but really kind of the dysregulation of all of our systems in this thing that was foreign and new. What was reporting in COVID writ large looking like? And then that impact that violent crime was having at the same time.
Definitely. And you're right that it is hard to make my brain want to go back to that particular moment. I was working on bail reform in New York at the time, and the headlines on that were absolutely wild. And we can talk a little bit about that in this conversation. So you have this really interesting thing going on in 2020, not interesting, disturbing, disappointing thing going on, which is that journalists say after George Floyd is killed, they say we've got to change how we're covering crime and and public safety generally make all these pledges about how they're going to do things differently. You see sort of like these big mea culpas coming out in large newspapers and other news outlets across the country, sort of really reckoning with the way they've covered Black communities and um, over the decades and even centuries of United States history. And then gun violence starts to really rise a few months later, well, that summer. And all those pledges, they don't go out the window. There are definitely some news outlets who are still doing really great work and many who were at the time, but you start to see a lot of the like really sensationalist, biased tropes of the 80s and 90s come back. All the things that people had written those mea culpas about reappear. So I sort of think of the two big problems there as being anecdotal crime coverage. So like I mentioned a bit earlier, really, grabbing onto something that has particularly lurid details, particularly stereotypical victims and perpetrators, and sort of covering that type of incident ad nauseum, on and on and on. So there's an interesting thing that some folks might remember, especially anybody here who was working in Chesa Boudin's office in San Francisco, where there's like an alleged shoplifting incident that's caught on camera by a reporter. It's put on social media. There wind up being more than 300 news stories about that one shoplifting incident in which no one was harmed over the course of about a month. And at the same time, Walgreens was in the middle of settling a multi-million dollar wage theft case, which had kept millions of dollars out of their workers' pockets, and there was one news story about it. So you just really started to see this like very, very anecdotal, contextless, sort of meant to be fearful, fear-inducing type of crime coverage happening. And at the same time, you see a lot of fixation on individual pathology. So you start seeing a lot of the sort of like fear mongering around kids. What's wrong with kids these days? These teens are out of control. That sounds a lot like the super predator conversations of the 1990s. We knew that wasn't true then. It's not true now. Teenagers were really going through something during COVID, and it wasn't so much about individual pathology as it was real serious systemic issues. There was also a lot of focus on really proximal causes. So things like bail reform, where someone gets out, goes on to cause harm, that's bail reform's fault. Now, those are the types of reforms where it's really easy for folks who aren't into them to sort of highlight the failures. The successes are much less easy to cover in the news. So no matter how successful a reform is, if you can find one bad story about it and you get it played on the news, you can really do a lot of damage. And those types of explanations are problems for a bunch of reasons. One is they just don't bear scrutiny. The actual numbers around these reforms, not only does research show that they don't increase crime, it's simply not possible that a few reform-minded prosecutors or bail reforms in a few cities and states could have caused a nationwide homicide increase that nearly every single rural, suburban, and urban area experienced. But that context was just straight up missing from a lot of the crime coverage that we saw in 2020 and 2021. So like the Willie Horton furlough conversation becomes the New York bail reform conversation, and the super predator of the 90s becomes the teenage carjacker of 2021. So that's what I saw and was really disappointed to see during those couple of years.
Yeah, I am. One of my favorite things to say is America is nothing if not consistent. We just morph the language. I do want to talk before we shift to solutions for a moment. We have been talking largely about traditional media while I have you, Laura, but social media, the ability to tell a story or to get a story or to have that one singular image go far and wide outside of our traditional realms. And so I know you work a lot with the traditional media. But what has been the impact of social media? I know at this moment I've silenced my phone because the ring notifications will come up and tell me that there's someone who's walking past a car and walked a little slow and beware. That there are these groups and apps and the like, next door and such that didn't exist even in the Willie Horton era that makes crime feel much closer, right? That disconnect that we're talking about isn't because, you went through the factors of the human brain and the things that are fed, but we have a broader appetite for news now, and sources that don't necessarily have an editor or a fact checker, um, and that are accessible at 24 hours a day. What's been the impact of social media in fueling the fears around crime and
I mean,
misinformation?
so many of the points that I would raise, you brought up in your very smart question. I mean, I think that um, Nextdoor and these types of apps sort of feed that real fear of the other that we just sort of have, that many folks have as human beings. And the news media is certainly guilty of this stuff too. But as you mentioned, Kim, there are some fact-checking standards, just like it has to pass through a few people. You usually need to quote a source. But Nextdoor sort of takes all of that away. So you just have like a sort of stream of consciousness in there. And we know from, decades and decades of research that people aren't the most reliable eyewitnesses. I mean, this is the dozens of prosecutors gathered here, and we all know like how tricky it can be when talking to eyewitnesses. People aren't always sure of what they see, but they're really willing to post about it on Nextdoor really quickly. And we know that hearing about these like individual incidents that happen near to us or close to us sort of have an outsized impact on our fearfulness relative to what they should, if we were actually weighing all the sort of like threats. If we were good at threat assessment, we would not be so worried, but we're not good at it. And so Nextdoor and those types of apps really play into that. And I think then if you move on from Nextdoor into just like Twitter or Facebook or other types of social media, the short form nature of those platforms does not lend itself to context or nuance. And I know I've said the word context a million times here, and I'm going to keep saying it because a crime story should be about helping people understand what is going on in their community. There needs to be historical context, geographical context, sort of like situating crime inside a broader array of factors that influence our safety. And there just aren't enough characters to do that on Twitter. And so I think that these are not healthy, productive places to be having conversations about safety a lot of the time. All that said, a lot of what gets talked about on social media, not Nextdoor, but other places, is still based on what people see in traditional news media. So I don't think it's worth sort of throwing up our hands as as if there are prosecutors here who work with traditional media and saying this doesn't have any point. I think it does. People on social media are often talking about what they heard on traditional media, so it's still worth engaging. And I'll just remind folks that when Pew asks people where they get their information about crime, traditional media still outranks social media. So there is still real power there for better and for worse.
Thank you for that. You're right. I, having to face traditional media as the elected prosecutor, and so for the prosecutors on the phone or on the call who are, this is a risk-averse profession. No one wants to make a decision that ultimately may come back and cause harm to someone else. And so there is, I think, a chilling effect that we see a lot when the media is super honed in on, back in 2020, it was electronic monitoring, right? During COVID, we were looking to, reduce the jail population because, congregate settings and the spread of COVID. And as the information was coming out, it was very clear that this was not a safe environment to have people in, not just the people who were detained, but the people who worked there who would have to go back home to their communities, that this was a public health crisis. And as such, there were efforts across, the country to reduce jail populations. And one of the mechanisms was placing folks on electronic monitoring. And I just marvel, having been away from the work for a moment, how a bracelet became a villain in Illinois, that in Chicago and Cook County. It was electronic monitoring. Someone on electronic monitoring did something, which is the proof that electronic monitoring is terrible. And it is those narratives that just catch. And so you started to see every story where you were waiting to see, was this person out on a bracelet? As you talk about bail reform, and I do want to talk about that for a minute because we have a little time and we're waiting for your questions in the box. The narratives around context and facts, and a really complicated process that most people don't understand, and then fear. Quick synopsis of like somebody accused, not yet guilty, does something else, revolving door. We heard revolving door a lot. And again, these are narratives that are not for the average viewer, the average citizen who's just at home trying to make sure that their lives are okay, their kids are okay. Those nuances and that context absent, what you are then hearing bail reform bad, electronic monitoring bad. And that is, I think, why I do think that there has to be accountability with the media for how those stories are told. One last piece, from my own recollection from that time period is that, as Ernesto pointed out, we saw a shift in the number of crimes that were being reported because people weren't outside. So you're right, retail theft was going down, robberies were going down. We saw that. We also saw that arrests were going down, largely, again, for the same reasons that we were, if we're asking our police officers, our first responders to go out in this foreign environment in which we know that they can get sick by breathing in the same air, those policing patterns changed. How police engaged changed. As a result of one of the uprisings early on, I was getting a lot of attention because we had a police chief that says, oh, the reason that people are looting, if you will, is because there's no accountability from the prosecutor. Now, as one who cares about data, what we were able to show was that they actually weren't making arrests. We can't prosecute if there's not an arrest. But the runaway of that narrative, the runaway of we're just going to report that the police superintendent says this is why crime is high without fact checking, without like looking at the data, without the full context, is something that was incredibly frustrating to me. And again, for the prosecutors that are on this webinar, we have to stay steady in the wake of those types of conversations, because it will dictate how you then decide to move. We didn't change how we were reducing our jail population efforts. We didn't change, and actually we did. We became more thoughtful after the pandemic about who we were asking to be held. The law around bail reform changed in Illinois, but it made it incredibly difficult when those narratives that weren't fact-checked by traditional media were allowed to just go for it. So, Laura, did you have something you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing here to like really emphasize what you're saying here. Having been in a sort of different position when I was talking to journalists about bail reform, and trying to say, like, number one, the story was inaccurate because the person you wrote about was not even released because of bail reform, or things like that. And then I would try to bring them the research that said, here's all the data showing that, rearrest for folks who are out on bail reform is no higher than it was, before the law, blah, 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 blah. We would bring to bear all this research. And, some journalists would take it seriously, but they're going to take prosecutors a lot more seriously. So if your office is engaging in some kind of an effort that will of a similar nature, EM, bail, changes in bail policy, whatever, really trying to like get out there and educate reporters beforehand, so that they know what to look for. They might be able to sniff out a story that isn't accurate. They're going to take your word quite seriously. And so I think there's a lot of value in trying to do some education before, during, and after these policy changes.
Thank you for that. And so I want to bring us back to happier, or at least more, I was about to say more settled times, but like these nothing settled about these times right now. These are crazier times, but the violent crime is going down. But it's let's talk about solutions. We do find ourselves as a country in major cities across the country seeing this decline at rates again that are pre-pandemic in Cook County that might be a 10-year low. There are learnings that Ernesto and Kim alluded to, things that we are seeing with the data. But I'm curious, Ernesto and Kim first, about what are you seeing that we should pay attention to that might have this be sustained? How do we sustain um, these reductions in gun violence in particular that you think the data illuminates for us as a path forward? Ernesto, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think one of the more positives that we are seeing is a lot of major cities are paying a lot more attention to data that they're collecting. It'll be a delay and it's not the best for like, randomized controls, but I think the transition to NIBRS data, right? Collecting more details about what's going on with not just homicide, right? We used to have the supplemental homicide reports where you can get victim information, weapon use, all that stuff. But now, since the FBI is essentially said NIBRS is mandatory. It's still up in the air what that really means. I think that's really positive. And even when cities that are not um, transitioning to that, places like Chicago, which we've always had in our crime data, they have really good data. Like it's pretty easy to understand, clean, download, all that good stuff. That is really important for public transparency. So I think one of the big promising aspects is it appears to be for many of these large cities, there's more of a commitment to improving data and also acknowledging that there's other solutions aside from only policing, right? Policing is a large part of that solution, and different cities will have different strategies. And there seems to be more of a commitment to exploring more evidence-based approaches. So that's more of the broad picture as I see it.
Great, thank you. Kim, you've got a lot of information about what wasn't working before or what the gaps were. What do you see as things that we need to look forward to in terms of solutions to sustain this reduction in violence?
Yeah, I would say a few things, and I'm specifically going to talk about solutions, promising approaches to reducing gun violence because that's our focus at the crime lab. So thinking about homicides and shootings, we know that's the most socially costly type of crime. So that's what I'm kind of bringing to the conversation is solutions around, reducing gun violence. And again, I think important to take a step back and really understand what drives gun violence in this country. And if you watch the news, if you watch, HBO, you might think that shootings and homicides stem from fights over drug turf, or, it's a robbery gone bad, or it's instrumental gang violence. I'm doing this in service of my group, my clique. And what we actually see when we look at the data is a lot of these shootings actually stem from arguments, altercations, fights that turn deadly because someone has a gun at hand. And we're a country awash in guns. Guns plus violence equals gun violence. So if our hypothesis at the crime lab is that if you can interrupt those really high stakes, quick moments where someone decides to use a gun to resolve a conflict, that can actually make a difference. And some of the best ways that we can see to do that is to provide individuals, whether it be mentors, credible messengers, violence interrupters, with the skills to de-escalate, or give individuals who might be involved in those situations the skills to de-escalate themselves. And that often takes the form of what we call cognitive behavioral interventions. So a suite of tools that we've found to be effective with school-aged boys, high school girls and boys, police officers, former child soldiers in Liberia. We've seen consistently that this use of cognitive behavioral interventions can reduce gun violence. It can reduce the likelihood that things escalate. It can also increase graduation rates because we know that education is in and of itself the most protective thing against future incarceration and future gun violence. So continuing to invest in education as a country is something that we absolutely need to continue to do. There are shorter term, programs, tools that we can invest in, such as cognitive behavioral interventions. And there are a lot of organizations around the country who are deploying these techniques. Community violence intervention is a term that I'm hoping many people on this call are familiar with. Community violence intervention groups, they really do try to prevent these escalations and retaliatory cycles by connecting with individuals who are at high risk of gun violence involvement, engaging them, offering them supports like transitional jobs, housing, case management, and cognitive behavioral interventions. And we've evaluated several of those programs in Chicago, and we found them to be quite effective in some cases. We estimate that the return on your investment. I'm not a finance person, so I don't know anything about ROI, but I do know that if you invest in a community violence intervention program, for every dollar you invest, you get between 8 and 20 back in social kind of savings. So we think that that is a really promising approach to reducing gun violence. And again, that's in addition to some of the other factors like education, making sure that our public education system is more robust will absolutely set us up to be a more safe country.
I'm going to push for a moment because I hear you and I agree with you wholeheartedly. I am, as a former elected official who is dealing with the fear that is permeating our communities, who've picked up that newspaper, who've seen that clip on the news. And what I heard repeatedly was like, I hear you, I hear you, I hear you. Long-term strategy, root causes, right? We talk a lot about dealing with the root causes of violence. And, post George Floyd, there was this, as Laura alluded to, the kind of this like mea culpa, like what can we be doing more holistically? And then it's like, but the right now, right? Like that feels like education's going to take us. It's been my whole lifetime. I've spent my entire life in Cook County, and I've seen homicide rates from when I was born to when I graduated from high school, which pale in comparison to where we are now. I recall in 1989, a friend of mine from high school was shot and killed, and he was one of almost 900 people who were murdered that year. And so to be back in this period during the pandemic where we saw homicide rates in Chicago, ticking up to 800 and still seeing these things that you talked about on your graph before, Kim, around education, around access to basic needs. How do we convey that? How do I convey to Laura and her partners in the media that this is a relevant talking point issue place for us to discuss violence when people want an immediate reaction to feel better? How do we do that?
I mean, let me know if this is compelling, but in Chicago, the Chicago Police Department, we often talk about that as kind of the tip of the spear for public safety. We talk about the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. The budget of the Chicago Police Department is $2 billion, $3 billion a year. Chicago Public Schools budget is $9 billion. So I would say that if I am, a taxpayer in the city of Chicago, in the state of Illinois, and I want to understand what are the different levers to make progress on public safety, I look at where the city is spending money and I see that they are spending 3 times as much money on education. Like, why wouldn't we try to get as much public safety ROI from that institution? So that's one argument I would make is like we're already spending billions of dollars on public safety in the form of education. Like we should make sure that the public schools is actually providing services that keep our young people safe. Of course, it's a longer term investment, but we all care about resources. And then I think the other thing I would say is cognitive behavioral interventions we do think of as more like short term investments that can be made in partnership with the public schools. For example, a number of the programs that we've evaluated that have this cognitive behavioral intervention element were delivered by the public schools. So I think public schools can be a really important implementation partner. But we've also partnered with, for example, example, the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center in Cook County and found that a 16-hour cognitive behavioral intervention program can reduce recidivism by 20%. So that again, it's the stays in the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center are short, and to kind of introduce this type of program that we can think of as almost free and reduces recidivism by 20%, like that is something we should definitely be talking about. So I would say, there are like very short-term programs that we can put into place, and we shouldn't lose sight of the $9 billion investment in a city like Chicago that we're making on education, which should also be thought of as an investment in reducing gun violence and improving public safety.
Thank you. And Ernesto, I want to follow up with you very quickly as well. What do you hope, having looked at the data over time and appreciating the nuance and the context of trends, and blips and causality and response, like all of the things, right? For our lawyers on the phone who are like, yeah, what should we not take from the data? So if I'm hearing Kim say that there are a lot of court involved investments that we can make to prevent violent crime, around education, around CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, other investments. What do you not want people to look at the data and go, so what you're saying is keep them in longer? Like what do you think what is the fear of some of the information that comes out of being misinterpreted, from the decline?
Well, I think one of the more important things is to consider the timing of the decline of when it's occurring, right? And not really ascribing it to one particular policy or practice, that it's something we're still trying to understand. And I think there's that aspect. There's a lot of positive to take away that I think a lot of people maybe don't really think of when it comes to looking at these declining crime rates. And I'll give one example. It's not necessarily violence, but it is still situated in harm. And if we look at the reduction in motor vehicle theft, right? Motor vehicle theft spiked tremendously from 22 to 2023, in a large part because a vulnerability of certain Kia and Hyundai vehicles were exposed, right? The company updated their software. You still see elevated rates, but then now you're seeing declines. And I think one lesson that takes is when it comes to just overall, community safety, right? Reducing fear of crime, things like shoplifting, is the role of the public sector, or the private sector, excuse me, the private sector in reducing victimization, reducing fear of crime, reducing concerns, right? There's, it's not necessarily locking things up at a store to prevent shoplifting, but it's maybe a worker in an aisle saying, "How can I help you?" or greeting someone at the door. These sorts of strategies that I think go a long way to reducing that sort of concern or worry, and even the opportunity of crime. And one more aspect of that I'll touch on is there's a good amount of research that talks about these lower level offenses, such as shoplifting, that we call like ensnare youth down to this criminal justice path, right? Starts with something low level, but then they get involved in this criminal justice system, and good positive future opportunities are then turned off to them, right? And it could set some youth, not all, for sure not all, but some youth on a criminal trajectory. So I think it's really important, we want to understand crime prevention and reducing crime is really at that point, how do we get someone from not committing a crime or being a victim in the first place?
Thank you. And excellent point. I'm going to pivot to our questions after I ask this last question of Laura. On that, one of the things that I am seeing locally, so I'll make that caveat, is around juvenile crime. So as Ernesto talks about ensnaring kids early, we've seen in Chicago what they're calling trends. Not crime trends, but I guess they are crime trends, but trends where young people are gathering after seeing things on social media, and then go, and if there are 300 kids out there, let's say 10 of them are getting arrested and causing harm, which by my math tells me 290 of them are not. But that's not the story that's being told. So again, in the all that's old is new as again, of that era of the super predator, of that era of like, we must do something about these children who are wreaking havoc. My concern, my haunches are up again because we have been here. What is the story that we need to tell in that realm? Because what now is happening is what happens, which is the response, which is, there was an effort to like do curfew, reduction of what they call a snap curfew. So the curfew comes, with just a few hours or minutes notice. Um, and it got legs. It went all the way to City Hall. And I mentioned it weighing in not at all on the policy, but there was a bevy of research and data that suggested that this doesn't work, that those curfews actually do not work to drive crime down. And so watching this play out in real time of, okay, here's the research and the data, but here's that video of these kids dancing on top of cars on Michigan Avenue and the fear of tourists walking by and an elected official who has to respond. What say you, Laura?
So I think one of the big things here is to spell this out, spell out what you just said. We have been here before. I think a lot of times when people's fear is heightened, they have a really hard time taking in a bunch of data. So I think it's important to lead with the data, to include the data, which shows us that, the number of young people being arrested and incarcerated is at an all-time low. Like we are not in some kind of era like of widespread, youth crime. But we are certainly in an era of moral panic about it. And we've been there before, a bunch of times, but most recently and most prominently in the 90s. And then what we did was incarcerate a humongous number of people and ruin their lives and their families' lives. So, if people aren't really ready to like sit with a whole bunch of statistics, they might be willing to sit with a story about what happens when you use these punitive policies. So I can think of a million of them. You like the folks on this call are going to have others, but there's that ProPublica story about a young girl who gets tossed in jail for not, gets tossed into custody, out of home placement for not doing her homework. Judge got mad about that through an out of home placement. Those types of stories. So if we want to sort of play on people's emotions, find something to play on people's emotions about what happens when you put these curfews in place and how we harm people, because we know it doesn't work. We just know it. And we know, to your point earlier about short-term interventions, not everything has to be like, we got to get all the lead pipes out of the city and that's going to take 40 years and we're not going to see the return for 70. And, yeah, we need to be doing that. We need to be getting lead pipes out of people's homes. But there are a million things we can be doing in the short term. Kim mentioned a whole bunch. I mean, the data on summer jobs programs is really, really good. That's something people could be putting in place right now, that is much more effective than curfews, but is speaking to the exact same group of people. If you are aware of a sort of particularly at-risk group in your neighborhood, so or in your city. So I think like, yeah, talk to people about what the data on what works and what doesn't work, but find some of these stories about the human impact of what happens when we don't listen to what works and who bears the cost of that and how.
Thank you. I'm gonna we've got about 11 minutes left, really like 10. So if you've got questions, please put them into the chat. But Estrella Lopez asked, she would be interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts on the role that prosecutors' offices have in fighting misinformation. In her experience, public information officers at prosecutors' officers take a risk-averse position, so they default to saying little or nothing. And having been in that role, I will concur with that. But this allows for misinformation to spread unchecked and contributes to erosions of trust, traditionally or particularly in the modern media landscape. And I want to second that opinion. I think oftentimes prosecutors' offices don't want to weigh in at all. Like we have an ethical obligation to not try our cases in the press, to make sure that we are not putting our thumb on the scale. And at the same time, when you are seeing misinformation, when you are seeing other actors, other stakeholders who are engaging in commentary that is not in fact truthful is really difficult. And so I can tell you personally, and I will open it to the others, at a certain point, I had to, tell our team that we were going to push back. We did exactly what you talked about, Laura, at one point where we had a lot of evidence around gun crimes, unsurprising to what Kim was saying earlier about the number of young people who were being arrested with guns, particularly young Black men who were arrested with guns. And so that narrative that was being presented was that these were folks who were dangerous. We had to sit down with reporters and put all of our data out there to say, I think it was somewhere around 62% of the people who were arrested for their first time gun offense had no other arrest in their history. So these weren't the repeat offenders that the media wanted us to believe that everyone who comes in circles out. We had a lot of people who were carrying guns. Many of them said because they were afraid, who had never had a history with guns or an arrest before. And to your point, Laura, what now happens to them as a result of this if we're not thinking thoroughly about what those outcomes are? And so I think there takes a level of I don't know if the word is bravery, but you have to put your neck out there when misinformation is being told. The other thing I will say about misinformation related to this question is on bail reform. Illinois eliminated cash bail a number of years ago. There was a concerted campaign, political campaign, and I dare would say a media campaign to scare people about this. And it was in the realization that people don't actually understand how bail works. They don't know how these decisions are made. And it was plastering the outlets with faces largely of Black and brown men. One fake newspaper was darkening the faces of the men who were there, that we were battling a purely tug at your fear with data. Like that's what this whole conversation is. But we have to be as relentless in the pursuit of the truth to say the hard truths in the face of what that looks like and be aware that people's fears are real. I think part of what some of the struggle has been is that this information, this data is very compelling. It is well thought out, it is very well researched, as you heard our two experts on data say, that they want to talk about the full context and that it might take time, like all of the things that make politics incredibly unsexy. But even as an elected official, even as a prosecutor, as unsexy as it is, and even though we deal holding victims' hands directly, looking them in the eye, meeting them at the worst moments of their lives, we cannot engage in practices that allow for that misinformation to take root. But I will open it up to my other panelists for their thoughts.
I mean, I would maybe tie this to a comment and another question I see about just the importance of, transparency in combating that misinformation. So, as State's Attorney Fox said, one of the things that we relied on in Chicago, there was a question about, how prevalent are people on electronic monitoring in the like homicide and shooting arrest data. And what we saw was that very few people who had been arrested for a homicide or a shooting in the city of Chicago were on electronic monitoring. And that was a question that we were only able to answer because the police department, the state's attorney's office made that data available. I like to think that after we brought some of that data to bear, people repeated it less because we could show them the graphs that said, two people on electronic monitoring were arrested for a shooting and there were, 3,000 shootings in the city of Chicago last year. Of course, every shooting is a tragedy, but it just was not the case that was the thing contributing to our gun violence crisis. So I really do think that specifically prosecutors' offices should not be shy about making data available. Yes, it makes you more vulnerable, but I think that it also just gives your efforts credibility when people it's you have nothing to hide. Like, here's what we're doing, here's the information. You're free to, come up with your own conclusions based off of your own data analysis, but we are not gatekeeping. And it allows researchers, it allows maybe your counter colleagues to, make their own claims. But I do think that transparency is the thing that will usher in, the light when we're talking about the reality of what's going on. And as Ernesto said, there is just not a lot of good data that exists on not even just the incidence of crime, but what happens after. And I think that's where prosecutors' offices have a really big role to play. And I know in Cook County, the data dashboards that the state's attorney's office put out were really remarkable. I know the Philadelphia DA's office has done similar work in that vein. And I think now is just not the time to be retreating. We need more information out there, of course, respecting privacy and confidentiality of survivors and people who are accused of crimes. But I think there's a lot of aggregate information that prosecutors' offices can be putting out there that will go a long way in kind of increasing public understanding of what's happening.
I'd like to go real, just if I can, Kim, real quick on that. Two quick points. One with the transparency side is I think it is really important for these prosecutors' offices, law enforcement agencies to put the data out because if they don't, someone else is going to tell that story. Someone else is going to find that homicide victim. The media is going to web scrape. They're going to do what they're going to do. And and I think these officials are going to lose sort of control of that narrative, whether it puts them in a good light or negative or otherwise. And the other point is, and it's related to the question about dashboards, is I think those are great and they should be there and many cities need them. But at the same time, it also can't be so complex to where the public can't understand them. Because I'll get emails from just, the public saying, what's crime in my city? And I look it up and I'm like, oh, because I look at these things all day. That's my life. But so I think there's both. So I think it's, you know, telling that story and holding yourselves accountable and also making it transparent in a way where the public can understand it, where other folks more the nerdy type can go dig in and get some of these more detailed data and trends.
Thank you. And Laura, did you have anything to add before I wrap it up?
I'll just say one thing, which is I know it can be hard to sort of talk about, like everyone on this panel has said, it can be really difficult to explain in such short order this rise and fall that we've seen in crime. But we had something similar happen in the 90s, and there's been a lot of work done on what happened there. And I think when prosecutors are looking for some way to sort of explain why they might be taking a less punitive approach, and at the same time that maybe just a really difficult horrific crime has happened in their community, we have 30, 40 years of evidence showing that if we are serious about stopping this stuff, just throwing a bunch more prison at it is not the answer. So while we might not be able to say a whole lot about, whoa, what the heck happened in 2024, we can say a lot about what happened in 1994. And I think bringing that stuff to bear, we can do that really confidently. And so I think that's, a sort of option for folks who are trying to figure out how to approach media with something really firm.
Excellent point. Thank you for that. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining with us today. This is an incredibly complicated, nuanced conversation that is really difficult to have. Facts and feelings are two very distinct things, and how we feel as humans and our need and desire for safety is very real, and how we as stakeholders and officials acknowledge that and also have the responsibility of operating in facts and educating is critically important. I want to thank our host at the IIP, particularly Noah McKee, who helped pull this together. I am moderating today because our fearless moderator, Rachel Marshall, was out. I want to thank Rachel for her assist on this as well. We will continue to bring you eye-opening webinars throughout the rest of the year at the IIP, and hopefully you'll share the information that you had today, and be critical consumers of news yourself. that as you listen to the stories that are being presented to you on the nightly news, ask yourself, how are you rigorously evaluating that that information is in fact correct, and being a person in your community who's able to speak with fluency and accuracy, with feelings and empathy, but also facts. So thank you all for joining with us today, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.